Okay, well, it's nice to see you after a bit of a break. Uh, Anyone got anything they want to share or ask? Start with.
Yeah, I'll share a little. I know it's when God teaches you, it's personally for you, but might help someone. When last we talked, seemed a little frustrated because I had a change in certain encounters where it seemed like my soul was being quickened, and it would change uh, the way the encounter would play out. Well, he was faithful to explain. He said he was putting an exclamation mark on certain things because there was an outworking in the natural that I had to do, and there was a feeding of my faith, you know, that he was doing. I had to know, because when you have a lot of night watch encounters, they kind of, I haven't been faithful to do all the searching them out and things like that. And this one encounter where my soul was quickened and it changed the way this woman's life was saved, it made me look her up, find her. I got the confirmation that she was, in fact, a real person who actually lived a couple cities from me. And I would not have done that if it had just played out the way, my spirit normally sees these things happen. So he said he was just putting punctuation marks on certain encounters so that I would search them out and it would feed my faith. So I was pretty encouraged.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. I mean, who knows what God does in a lot of these things? He knows exactly where we are and what we need. And certainly to get our attention, he'll do lots of things like that. Main thing is to respond. I mean, I think that's the key, to respond correctly to the things that God's showing us, and then things flow from that perspective. So, yeah, interesting. All right. Anyone else got anything they want to share or ask?
Well, if no one speaks up, I have a lot going on. I will continue. Mike, have you noticed that the men in white linen, the men of upright, that there are like different rankings of them? I have seen different, I don't know, different callings on them or different roles in the kingdom. There's like a higher ranking of some of them. I don't know if they're more ancient ones or what, but they have a different role.
Um, yeah, I would think of it as that, different roles rather than higher ranks, because I don't really believe there's a hierarchy in the kingdom. I think we're all equal in God in terms of love. He loves us all the same. So I don't really feel that there's a sense of um, anyone's more important than anyone else, but people do have different roles. And therefore, some of the we have a connection with some of the white men in white linen who are assigned to do particular things, and they all seem to have a similar uh, history, if you like, certain areas of their history which seem to be connected. Um, but definitely, they have roles. I mean, some of the Old Testament saints, Moses and others, they obviously have um, connection into some things, both bringing things together in the new covenant. But I mean, the main thing again is just if they engage, or is finding out why and what they want and being in cooperation with them. Um, Certainly in the court of the upright, there seem to be, how I've encountered it, there seem to be many of them connected to one another and engaging in seemingly in areas or spheres of government. But I don't sort of see it as rank as much as just positions and roles in the kingdom. Um, you
Yeah,
know,
that makes sense.
yeah. Okay.
So you wouldn't like the angels. Now, angels, some angels are more decorated. Um, they do seem to have higher rankings of angels. Does that make
Yeah.
sense to you? Yeah.
Well, I think again, it's really what you mean by rank in a sense. God authorizes people and gives them authority, and therefore, yes, there are those that carry that authority. For instance, the 10 canopy of angels. There are those who head up those canopy, and therefore they are responsible. I think so long as we see position as responsibility rather than uh, identity, then it's just how it
Right.
is. You
Right.
know, and I think you have the angels that are mentioned in the Bible, like Gabriel and Michael and others that seem to have a connection with different courts and with different realms of government, which is what you'd expect in a system that's a kingdom, and how the kingdom functions is through delegated authority and things. I think it's just what we tend to do in a earthly sense is we tend to or often get our identity and authority from positions we're in, and that then often can mean we try and use that position to give us influence or effect. And I think God really wants us to know our authority from our identity, not the other way around. And so it's just being aware of that the soul can use position for its own ends rather than the spirit being directed in that. So
Yeah, I don't think I mean that
yeah,
importance when I say ranking. I do mean authority,
yeah,
role.
oh yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think within any kingdom there's going to be different levels of government, and of course we're maturing in that ourselves into sonship. In terms of lordship, kingship. There are different roles that we have. Some people are operating in royal priests. Some people, are operating into the whole chancellor's role and different things like that. It just means that that's a role that we've been assigned, and that's part of our destiny, and we outwork it. Um, within everyone who is um, in the realm of the kingdom is serving God's purpose. Um, yeah, I mean, is that serving God's purpose? Um, and they don't lord it over each other. I think when Jesus said, make sure you don't lord it over people, that's how his kingdom functions from a servant-hearted position. Everyone serves God. And if you think of authority as serving people to help them fulfill their function, rather than lording it over people, even in the angelic realms, there's no sinful attitudes or wrong ways of thinking in that realm. So, if you have a head of an order, it doesn't mean that that head is doing anything in a wrong way. It just means that they are serving that order to facilitate that order fulfilling its function in God. And I think if we see it from that perspective, I think it will help us keep a balance when we come to, well, how does government outwork on the earth? Because it has to be a reflection of that heavenly government, which means it's all about serving and releasing and encouraging rather than ruling over. In a sense, we don't rule over people. We rule over the environment that we've been given authority in, the spheres of government that we've been given authority in, not over people, because every single person has a direct engagement with God. He is there covering in terms of rulership, and it isn't about then ruling people. It's about serving people, and serving people is about promoting that person to fulfill the best that they can do, rather than in the worldly system, you know, positions or hierarchy operates in a totally different way. And if you can find somewhere which operates in a servant way, then you're going to find a much better experience when you engage in natural things, without a doubt. Um, but yeah,
Yeah, he's been clear. The greatest of all is the servant of all.
yeah.
He's very clear on that.
Oh, definitely so. Yeah. You know, but we're not perfected. So there's always a danger that if we don't deal with the soul and denying ourselves that position for that ruling, then we can always tend to default to a negative position. So it's something to keep an eye on and to look out for in our attitudes and our approach to people, to make sure we are serving from the right heart and with a generous heart and in that way. But yeah, definitely so. Okay. All right. Has anyone else
Michael,
got anything? Yeah. Yeah. Hi, Stella.
hi. Could you give a little insight on the Council of or the Court of the Fathers? Or what are some of the protocols when you go there, or what exactly goes on?
Um. Yeah. My experience in some of these courts has been. I'm not sure whether it's um, generic or whether it's just specific for me when I went. So when I've gone to the Court of Councils of the Fathers, it's been for very specific authorizations to do certain high-level things. That's been my experience of it. And when I engaged there, I saw two benches of 12 bringing together the old and the new in one body. So hence the 24 elders. So that was what I engaged when I engaged there. And when I went in, it was almost like I was given a mandate to do something that I was unclear the specifics of, and I went there, and wisdom took me there initially to find a clarity to what I was authorized to do, and they gave me very, very clear directives into certain things. Um, so that was my experience, and I've been there a few times. There may well be other very different experiences that people get in engaging at that court. I mean, some of this I think is not trying to be prescriptive about things, but trying to open up the realm for people to experience themselves, and then what they need to do in that court will be how they are to engage it. And so someone else may go to the Court of the Council of the Fathers and have a very different experience than mine, and that's all really valid, which is why I don't tend to try and describe it in too much detail, because I want people to find out for themselves what it is. But it's a higher level court. I mean, you're not going to access that court when you're first learning things,
No,
um,
I don't.
because there is a sense where there is a maturing in things, and I didn't engage that court, until this year. In fact, that was the first time, or last year. I mean, it's the first time I actually really engaged in there. Several of the other courts I had experiences of, but didn't know much about them until I went back. And my spirit hasn't led me to go to that court very often, and therefore I don't do it. Whereas a few years ago I would have sought it out to try and understand, find out, get all the protocols really clear. And I really feel that I don't want to try and do that, in such a way that it limits or prescribes something for people, which I think needs to be experienced and encountered and then unveiled for individuals. But the top three court of Kings, Council of the Fathers, Court of the Upright, work together. That Court of the Councils of the Fathers is connected to the top three level courts: the Court of 70, the Court of the Lord, and the Court of Judges. And so it brings into the heavenly realms that which comes out of the heaven of heavens, which is above. So everything below is about love coming down, and it's all serving out of love, and everything above is more of a the place where God engages things rather than his presence. So I've encountered the face of God within the dark cloud in that realm. And when I first engaged some of those courts, I couldn't see. Not that I couldn't see in that I wasn't getting vision. It was just so bright. The atmosphere and the dynamic of those places was just at a totally different level of my personal experience, which is why when you engage God there, he's in a dark cloud, because he is the fullest brightness of light, which is, we have to be careful about. So when I first engaged some of those courts, my eyes took time to adjust to the different level of brightness, the different atmosphere. Even the very atmosphere of glory that's there seems to be at a different level, or is thicker. That's all I can describe it as. It just seems to be thicker, and everything seems to be an increased level of everything there. That's all I can describe it as. But the main thing would be, if you feel called to engage in some of those places, then set the desire of your heart on it, and then engage wisdom. Ask her if you can go there. But again, it's like, is there a particular mandate or something that you feel that you need to engage there for? When I was given the mandate to engage the Court of 70 and present a case, I was given it by the Court of the Councils of the Fathers. They authorized me to do that. They authorized me to engage the 12 Chancellors' houses. So when I've engaged there, it's always been to take me to another level of engagement or revelation and experience, and they gave me permission to go into some different things. So those have been my experiences, but I'm sure there may be many other things.
I was recently given a plaque. I was in a court somewhere, and probably the court of the judges, now that I think about it, because I was not there alone. There were other people there, and they were receiving as well. We were all receiving the same thing. It was a plaque that had our picture on it and our name underneath, inscribed on a gold plate, and underneath our name it said judge. Now, prior to that, I'd received the scales of justice and a gavel, and then I'd also been shown something that said, a street sign that said magistrate justice, but they each led up to the final thing, me being given the plaque along with some other persons who were there. Yeah. I've since found out there were several other people who've had the same experience with the same plaque. In reference to the Council of Fathers, I asked because someone else was asking about it, seeking information, and wasn't seeing to be finding it. But like you said, when you go into these places the first time, sometimes you're not acclimated to it, you're not sure where you are, and you have to pursue it and go back and look it out. But I have another question. What insight do you have on the 7 pillars of wisdom from Proverbs 9:1?
Well, I have been engaging that. I mean, one of the things to say, when I was in LA, I also met a few people who had received plaques in encounters. So it's something which seems to be happening at the moment. I guess because God is wanting people to be ready to take charge of the courts in terms of a judgment position, and then how that gets worked. In terms of the 7 pillars of wisdom, first time I engaged that was probably 2010 in an encounter, and it was like it was a bit freaky, so I sort of put my hand into it, and it felt like, whoa, this is tangible, and it felt like I was going into a dimension or into another place of engagement. But I was I didn't go through it at that point. I sort of held back from going into it, maybe just because I didn't feel ready to or whatever. Recently, I've been engaging with that, and a friend of mine up in Seattle area, or up that way, I think it was up that way, somewhere Portland or that area. He had been pursuing this, and he shared some things with me that made really sense when I looked at my own encounters, and he was looking at the 7 pillars of wisdom. When you go into them, and I've been back into them since, it's like they open up into a place of engagement. And what he found was that each of the pillars was a process of getting blueprints or mandates clarified and brought into a position of usage, or brought into a position where then you have the authority to use it. So sometimes you get given, let's say, a blueprint and you're unclear about it, or you're given a mandate, and he found that there was a whole procedure where each of those pillars had a particular governmental function in bringing a blueprint or mandate into the completion where it could then be brought into use or into the records. And I will go into that personally more myself so that I can explain it and teach it to people. At the moment, I've just have a revelation and some experience, but I've not taken something through, because most of the things that I've got in terms of blueprints, mandates, tend to be pretty much formed and I understand them. But a lot of people don't, and I think this could well be a very useful place of encounter to help in the formation of some of those things and the development. It's almost like a development pathway where certain engagements bring maturing of this thing, or the development of this thing until it's in fully formed position. That's what I can say of that. I don't really feel in a position to explain it fully because I've not yet fully outworked it, and I don't want to give people theory, but one day I may well do so when I feel led to engage it a bit more. But
Yeah.
the friend of mine is worked through several things through that process, so he may teach it or explain it.
Yeah, I know. I
do
know who you're speaking of. I've engaged with him as well, and he gave me some of the information. And like you, I've been, it's new in a sense,
Yeah.
but I've found, as he said, I've went into, because they actually open up,
Yeah.
and you can go inside of it and receive further information. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. Thank you.
Okay.
Mike, this is Steven.
Hi.
Hey, I've been teaching on the courts here in Austin for a while, and now we've got finally got people willing to get on benches. So we've got 3 different cities with 3 in each of the cities. They each live in the city. They're going to sit on the bench. So what advice would you have for starting those in the cities? Well, I mean, when they don't know anything, we just.
Okay. My advice would be not to start if they don't know anything. I would.
Well.
Yeah. I mean, in a sense, it's like, for me, benches form around governmental blueprints. So I would always encourage people to get a blueprint before they try and, because there's nothing to govern without actually having a blueprint that authorizes them and shows them what to bring rule into. Because, what you don't want to do is get people who don't know what they're doing taking on a new name of something and then just doing it in an old way. So they really have to understand that a bench is to serve and is foundational for everything to be built on, and to be, they have to release people. That's the key in a functioning of a bench. Is always going to be to serve and release other people to fulfill their destinies and roles within whatever it is God is wanting to establish. So if people really don't understand the basic principles of it, they could just go off into an old way of understanding things and try and just use it as a ruler thing to make things happen, and that's really not what it's about. Any bench really who is going to function together really needs to establish relationship. It has to be a relational thing. There's got to be openness, honesty, transparency. It isn't just, oh well, we're just governing, therefore we don't need to do any relational stuff. You have to be in unity, you have to be submitted to one another, you have to be, in a sense, very clearly that there is a bench operates totally mutually in equal authority. And you'll find that immature people, one person will try and rule the bench if you're not careful, because they'll be going back to an old model where there needs to be a first among equals and someone has to carry the buck and all those sort of humanistic viewpoints. It doesn't work that way. And for a bench to function in a city, they must carry the city in their heart. They must really have that as part of their mandate from God. You can't just, oh hey, I'm going to set up for this city, and it's not part of your destiny or it's not part of your authorization from God. It can't just operate out of will or choice. It must be called and appointed to that position. Otherwise, and what I see a lot of around is people just tacking on the bench of three title to an old wineskin, and it's really just a new name for an old system, and actually it's not an old system. It's a new, totally different way of bringing government and establishing the kingdom from that perspective. So I would advise taking time to get the foundations of that really in place before people start weighing into governmental things that they may not be mature enough to handle. And it's better to take the time to establish it. When we looked to establish our bench of three second time round, we took 3 or 4 months to establish the relational connections before we were invested into that. Because the other two, the bench, really didn't feel they understood or felt adequately equipped or mature enough to be able to take on that role, and it was that they were absolutely right. But when we worked through the issues, made sure we were open, honest, we made sure that we were in unity with one another, that we respected each other's different gifts, that there was no competition within the bench, it was all about serving God's blueprint. Then when we all got invested into that position of government, everything changed, and but we took our time. So I wouldn't rush these things. If people don't fully understand, better they don't fully engage in something until they really start to understand how to do these things. And it's not easy out there because there aren't many people who are doing it. And those people who originally started teaching about this stuff and bringing it, they're not really doing it, so they haven't really got that much testimony to give you. When we first started doing this, Ian Clayton came here, and we totally resonated with what he was saying in 2011, so we looked to put that into place. When he came back in 2012, we were struggling to sort of outwork it, and we were asking him for some help and wisdom. And he's basically said, I don't really know anyone else is doing this. I'm not doing it. We tried doing it. It didn't work. You're on your own. Now we're 4 years down the line, and there are more and more of benches being established, but some of them are just in name only. There's nothing new about it. I even know people who are setting up benches to serve them and their ministry, and it's just like, how can that possibly be a reflection of heaven? You have other benches that you have the senior leader, and effectively it's not a bench because the other two just defer to the senior leader because that's an old model. It's not about having an earthly form of government, it's about having a heavenly form of government operating foundationally in the earth. It's one of those things that I have some concerns over from what I've seen and what I've heard, And I've had to sit down with several benches and mediate through those issues with them when one person wanted control and wanted the others to submit to them and refer everything to them, and it was just like they didn't believe that was the right way of doing it, and in the end that person basically had to leave that bench and actually leave the whole group because they weren't prepared to operate in a mutually submitted way, and the blueprint was given to all of them, and it certainly wasn't about one person being the senior person in it. I've had to sit down with others who got a blueprint, but their agendas were so different they couldn't walk together and walk it out. I mean, this is not an easy process. It is definitely not an easy process, and it's better to take your time to work it through. And we've certainly done that. Because if you don't establish the bench of 3 in the right way, you'll certainly not be able to establish a bench of 7 or a bench of 12, should that be something that eventually, because you'll have a wrong model from the beginning. So that the bench of 3 servant model must be carrying the right heart of what government is, and it's all about releasing people upwards to engage. So when we have our bench of 3, our bench of 3 does not tell our bench of 7 what to do. We support and help them and encourage them to go and hear God for themselves. Our bench of 3 doesn't tell our 7 mountains what to do. We all encourage them to hear God for themselves. We help the process because we get together and we review things and we communicate and we talk about those things. But it's very much a process that you have to work through and discover and outwork, because it's very different, and it's guaranteed to bring things up. If there are issues of the need to rule or the need to govern or rulership giving authority or giving identity, and that stuff has to get resolved in the process. We did a number of court cases to deal with some of the issues that arose because the situation causes them to come to the surface, because God doesn't want them hidden, away in those things. So, I'm not sure whether that helps or not, but my experience in this is it's not an easy process.
Well, I probably should clarify that a little. I've been on a bench for our community for a while, and we went through that process you were just talking about. We submitted one to another. So we're not running into those issues, but the Lord been talking to me about a bench of 7, and I was like, Lord, how's that going to be outward? So we started to pray for those people to come in. We started to say, okay, we have have a bench of 3 in that city, a bench of 3 in this city, and then this city, then we can have a bench of 7 out of that covers the county, and so on. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense, but have those cities, is there a blueprint that's been released for that city which carries the vision and the values of that? Because actually, just in my experience, God does not form a bench and then they try and then get a blueprint. It's like God wants to release a blueprint and then a bench form around it, because that means that the bench are already the blueprint's in place and the bench recognizes that they're there to serve that, which is different from, okay, well, 3 people getting together and we want to find out what we're supposed to do. I'm not saying that it can't happen that way, because I've helped people establish benches, but generally they haven't formed a bench before they've got a blueprint. There have been a group of people who sought God for a blueprint and established a blueprint, and then the government formed around that as God sort of brought that government. To me, it's like, what is, how does the 3 cities relate to the bench that you're talking about being on? Is that a structural connection? Is that just a relational connection? How does that actually work? Um, because for me, any blueprint must be autonomous
Well,
in
the people that I'm talking about, they carry a mandate for the city,
yeah.
like we do, and um, because we're connected, the three cities are connected, and we're all under one county.
Okay.
So we started to come together that way. So, okay, what are y'all seeing? So we could work together to help bring about or help each other bring about the mandate or the blueprint um, in the county-wide.
Yeah.
So trying to we use the courts all the time, um, and maybe we're just trying to put a label on something we're already doing. Uh,
Possibly. I mean, depends really what sort of courts you're trying to use. I mean, when I mean, it sounds quite similar to what we're doing in our region here. So, I'm part of a bench of three for our local ecclesia. I'm also part of a bench of three for our actual area, and I'm also part of another bench of three for our region. And in the regional bench, we've been meeting for the last 2 or 3 years and been seeking, okay, what is it we're called to do? What is our mandate? Because we're not building something. It's not. We haven't got a blueprint because we're not building anything. We have a mandate to help release other blueprints in our region. One of them would be, therefore, what we're doing locally. It's all about facilitating and releasing, and sometimes people may not ever know that you're doing that, but they'll benefit from the fact that you're doing it because you're authorized to release, let's say, benches in your county. So for us, our region is made up of, we have counties, but we have like 6 counties in our region, which is the southwest region, of the UK. And what God gave us a strategy to call to release a sound, and then 2 years later to call to who heard that sound, and then to call a gathering. And so we've actually just had our second gathering last weekend, or last Saturday. And again, as a bench, our role was to help facilitate them all hearing God, engaging relationally, making connections to one another, so that they could actually see foundations of cities of refuge or embassies of heaven formed within the different regions. And actually, one of the first thing we did, because they were looking, again, you're looking for an old model, they were looking for us to be hierarchical, and we were saying, look, we're just here to facilitate you hearing God for yourself and doing what God's telling you to do. We're not telling you what to do. We just want to create an environment where heaven's open, where you'll be able to receive, engage the angelic realm and engage the realm of the kingdom to receive what you need for the region. And we did that, and people started to gather. When we then looked to engage heaven for the different areas of our region, we actually said, we felt God say, look, sit together in the regions that you come from, then let's just engage heaven and ask God where he wants you to be, rather than where you're sat geographically. And 6 regions actually became 4, because they actually felt God say, no, I want you to join up with this other group and make a connection there, because this is how I view the map of your region, which is not how man has made the map. So it's like, okay, we're totally up for God reshaping the maps that men have drawn to have a more heavenly perspective on what those areas are. And when we came back together, then the next time we then looked to pursue that a little bit more, did some court cases to remove any obstacles, because there was a vision of angels with scrolls waiting to release those scrolls to establish the blueprints for cities of refuge in each area as like places of fire, but in the atmosphere that were being opposed because there were legal rights that within each area that had hindered. So we encouraged each group to get together, do a court case, find out what the legal rights were, so that those angels can release those scrolls. Now, our rolling it as a bench of 3 for our region is just to facilitate them engaging, hearing God, and doing whatever we can to help them in the process. There's no sense of, well, we're the bench, therefore we're telling them what to do. We're just doing what we're called to do, which is actually help establish the government of God in our region. But it must be as those people receive a call, a blueprint, and then form government themselves. There's no structure that we're going to set up. It is purely relational, and that's how we want to see everything in the kingdom function, through relationship and not structure or hierarchy, or in any way creating an organization out of something which is a relational thing. So, you know, those are some of the things that we've done in our area, and it's taken a while to do that. But, you know, you can see progress, and you can see people beginning to get it and beginning to receive things from God, and then they're responsible for what they do with that. So.
Yeah, that's why we need you to come out to Austin.
Well, you know, having gone to all the four corners of the US, and God did say, you know, he was going to deal with the spine of the nation and the heart of the nation. So I guess Texas all the way through, right up through, is probably the spine of the nation. So, you know.
Yeah, Austin's the capital of Texas.
Yeah.
That's where all the legislation is.
Yeah. You know, so, you know, I mean, you know, I'm willing to try and come and help in these sort of areas. Definitely in LA, you know, when I went to you know, recently just been to California and to Phoenix, you know, it was a very clear thing to just, I want to see government established. And, you know, we just did some encounters and engagements with some people, and, you know, they received very clear directives and blueprints for LA in terms of establishing 7 cities of refuge within the city, you know, and a bench formed. That bench immediately started to call and release others, and then 2 other benches started to feel call for their region within LA. You know, that happened within just 2 or 3 days of just being there and just looking to help them. They did it. I mean, I just provide some encouragement and support and some insight, and from my obviously having done it, to try and help. But, you know, it's something which, you know, I believe God wants to do, because I believe now the 4 corners are established, the perimeter of the US needs to be established, which is sort of right across the south, right across the east, right across the west and the north, because then you're really going to start to see, you know, whatever God is wanting to establish really start to take place, you know. So yeah.
There have been several prophetic words over Austin saying to be a city of refuge. So,
yeah.
Yeah,
so, you know, I'm sure. Yeah, I'm sure it is. I think it's just making sure that what a city of refuge is defined from a heavenly perspective, rather than what people think it might be from an earthly one. Because you say that, I've stopped using the term somewhat, because it creates a picture of something which I'm not sure most people really grasp. I'm starting to use embassy of heaven, because that describes something which is having the authority of heaven on the earth. You know, it's a synonymous term, but sometimes, you know, people grasp hold of things like city of refuge, and they see it as a defensive place rather than an offensive place, because essentially it's a place to establish a beachhead of heaven on the earth, to then expand and see the kingdom expand and fill the earth. You know, it's not a place of refuge from the enemy to wait for Jesus to rescue us, which is what some people take when they hear the term, you know. So
that's what I was saying. We need to redefine the word refuge, because they have the wrong idea.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I went to when I went to San Diego, I engaged with a guy there. I was staying with him, and he suddenly, you know, I said, well, okay, what's God been doing? What have you got any sense of vision? He said, yeah, I was given a mandate to establish an embassy of heaven. So I said, well, that's really interesting. What do you mean by that? And he was telling me some of the things that God was showing him. I thought, well, that's great. And he said, trouble is, every time I talk to someone about it, they just look at me with glazed eyes, and I've got no idea what I'm talking about. So actually, I spent most of the time in San Diego really unveiling and giving some revelation and teaching on this is what an embassy of heaven is. I mean, I had some great fun. I mean, I got stuck on one slide about the mandate of sonship for about an hour and a half, and I'd never even taught on it before. I just sort of just shared stuff that came out of heaven, really. So I had a really good time there, just engaging, in a home, because I'm not bothered about numbers of people who gather. I just want to gather with people who I can connect to relationally. So it was like 15, 20 people who gathered in their home, and we just explored together, which was great.
Yeah, I call it harvesters.
Yeah.
Mike, I feel that there's something around the city of refuge, because it's lately in the last 2 weeks or so, I've found that it has caused a lot of contention with people's, I guess, their set mindsets of what it is. And I believe you have to be faithful to the blueprint and the mandate that has been given to you, because that's what our responsibility is too. This is why we, as you keep saying, there's no set prescription of what it has to look like, because it all depends on where the Father's setting it up. It's going to have a unique, almost flavor to it to fit that region. One of the things the Father said to me lately was to go to the court of the affairs of nations when you want to get a greater understanding of what his desire is for a particular nation and what is on the scroll of that nation, because what he's giving you to do in reference to that city of refuge, again, I think such a clarity or consensus, because there are certain foundations to the truth of God that we must understand. He's not a God of confusion. So even if each of them has a uniqueness, they're still all going to fall into a certain framework that everybody across the board can see. And sometimes we say that we don't want to build an hierarchical system, but then we fall into that trap, because if I don't agree with the way that you think it should be set up, suddenly you become very dogmatic and defensive about your progressive revelation, and everybody else is wrong. And I think that's the first sign of error, that you've stepped away from the blueprint and gotten into self in regards to it. Because nothing in this is about us. It's about all of releasing people and empowering them to enter in. And the more I engage with people, the more I find I just recommend to them, go and ask. Go and inquire. Because when you go and ask, you get that experiential revelation that nobody can take from you, as opposed to me or somebody else just saying, this is what it is. It's steps 1 through 7, and you've got it. That's not what it is.
No, you're absolutely right. And anyone who wants to boil it down to a formula is going to put a structure around it which restricts. In essence, a blueprint, let's say for an embassy of heaven or a city of refuge, will be unique in every place because it's designed for that place. I think there are some principles that are there because they're heavenly principles of how it's governed and how it's ruled, and I think that's a key. But what it looks like, what the 7 mountains it has attached to it, what the spheres are of government, how it's going to do that is totally to be outworked from the blueprint that's been given, and any ongoing developing those mandates into it. And some of those things will be very, very different than others. And to be honest, it's like if a place is to be a storehouse for a harvest, it cannot be virtual. I think that the virtual nature of some of these things, where people are, oh well, we're just going to do this in the cloud, and we're just going to do this. Basically, you will never disciple people without getting your hands dirty and getting involved in their lives. It won't work. I mean, people who want to run this as a virtual system do not want to be responsible for discipleship, and that's why they're doing it that way, because they don't want to get close enough to people, because they're not relational and they don't want to expose their own lives, and they've set up systems to keep them isolated, which is why they're setting up things and saying this is all virtual. You know, there are different things. Some cities of refuge may be one ecclesia that forms. Some of them may be groups of ecclesia that join together to form that and work together, because that's what the blueprint will determine. And for us, we know that we're called as part of our blueprint to be part of a city of refuge. Now, we would love to be part of a city of refuge with other churches in our area that come together in agreement to outwork God's blueprint for the area. If people won't do that, or no one accepts that, then we'll do it ourselves. But our desire is to do it with others. So we're reaching out to connect with others so that we can work together in that process. But we know it's our mandate to be part of one, so if we have to form one ourselves, then we will, but it's not what God intends. But sometimes people don't respond, you know, and we are having that situation here, where, you know, we had a very clear vision of 7 angels with 7 scrolls for the 7 spheres of government in our area. This was in a leaders gathering, and it was a very clear vision given by 2 people who saw the same basic thing. And when that vision was given, it essentially called for a choice. Do you want to be part of this? And actually, most of them said no. They weren't prepared to give up control of their own situation to be part of something bigger. And one of them even said, well, if we went down that route, what about our finances? People might not stop giving, and then we wouldn't be able to pay people. I mean, it was just like, what? You know, don't you realize that God gives you the resource to do whatever you're going to do? But those are where people are coming from. So, you know, I still bless them. I'm still in relationship with them. But until they either decide to change their heart or mind, you just got to work with those who are wanting to pursue the same thing. But for me, it's like, if you're going to be a storehouse and you're going to transform your community, you have to have a physical representation of that. A bench that serves the region, let's say our bench serves our region, doesn't need a physical representation, because we're doing a heavenly role to facilitate others doing those things in their regions. We don't need a physical location to do that. So I totally accept that there can be benches and for regions and nations that don't need a physical location, but there do need to be physical locations. Otherwise, you're never going to truly change and transform a region or an area if you don't change people's lives and if you don't see people come and gather. You know, essentially, an ecclesia is people gathering around a blueprint. And, okay, there is a sense where there can be virtual gathering, but it's very dangerous to set up a whole system that's dependent on virtual gathering without there being any physical representation of that. Because what does it represent? Nothing tangible to change a community or transform it on the ground. You know? So for me, I think there are a number of people I know who are sort of doing that. A lot of them have been hurt and don't want the relationships to be hurt again, so they're using it as a protection mechanism against being hurt. And you can't afford to do that. If you're going to establish anything, you must be open, honest, and work through those hurts. You know, and I can see people who are hurt, and I can see, you know, I can see what they give off, you know, because they're still coming out of hurt. And they'll develop all sorts of fancy systems and protection mechanisms and coping mechanisms to protect themselves and say this is the new latest revelation from heaven. We're going to do all this and we don't need cities of refuge on the ground. The reality is you do. You know, we want to see a harvest come in. It has to come into physical locations. You know, Jesus has skin on, and we're his body on the earth. It's not a virtual body. We are the temple of the Holy Spirit. People need to engage with flesh and blood people. You know, and for me, that's a key. Every one of those places will look absolutely different because they are very clearly given different spheres of influence. Government have different things. You know, our call here is to engage the disadvantaged. So we work with people with addictions. We work with people who are homeless. We work in those spheres because that's our DNA. We wouldn't say anyone else has to do that, but we do it. You know, other people have different calls, and I know some of you have specific calls for specific people groups. You have specific calls into particular situations. You know, and the blueprints may be different from ecclesias than other things. I'm not saying there can't be a multitude of different blueprints that God gives for different things, but essentially it's got to be touching real people. You know, it can't just be, you know, without engaging people in a relational way. You know, and I can smell the old things that keep people from really wanting to do something from a fresh thing when I engage it. When I hear certain people say certain things, I just think, oh my word, yeah, where's that's coming from, you know? But you know, who knows? We're going to, over the next number of years, we're going to see a lot of change take place.
I absolutely agree. One more question.
Yeah.
I heard you on another hangout say something the other day that the temple is actually not a cube as most of us think, but is a triangle.
What was that? What was a triangle?
You were. I was listening to a hangout you did, I think, with the Burning Ones, or something like that, and you'd mentioned that the most people think of the temple as the New Jerusalem as a cube or a square.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's a pyramid. Yeah.
Yes, a pyramid. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's a pyramid shape because that represents a mountain, and you know, it is all tied into Metatron's cube and the whole governmental spheres that God calls us to function in alignment to. And it's complicated, you know. There's a complicated shape and pattern that where intersecting dimensions of government all take place. But if you actually look at the New Jerusalem and the description with the dimensions, it says that it's a square and a vertical dimension, and people immediately assume that must be a cube. But in reality, Jesus is the capstone. And a capstone can only be the top of a pyramid. And the top of a pyramid is a mini pyramid, if you like, that sits on the top, which just finishes it off and holds the whole thing together. And so, yeah, it's because we're talking about a governmental representation of the mountain of the house of the Lord. Isaiah 2:2. Which is going to be raised up above all the other mountains, and people will stream to it, and all the other hills, which will be when the mountain of the house of the Lord raised up, everything else will appear like hills in proportion to the authority that the mountain of the house of the Lord has. And that is a mountain that is reflected by a pyramid. You know, I mean, I had that revelation in 2005, and I've been, you know, pursuing what that means ever since, and having no idea of really what it meant then connecting it, then God showing me that it's connected to the four faces of God, and it's connected to, you know, that aspect of how government is formed, you know, a redefinition of ministry from the order of Melchizedek. I mean, I didn't have any idea of the name order of Melchizedek, but in 2005, I was shown a redefinition of ministry from a heavenly perspective. You know, I didn't understand it, but I was shown it as a diagram in a vision. So I've been pursuing what that means for the last 10 years really, or more. And so when it comes to those things, what we need to get away from is seeing things as a physical manifestation of something, which is actually something which is talking about spiritual authority. The mountain of the house of the Lord isn't a physical mountain. It's the symbol of actual spiritual governmental authority, represented like Mount Zion, represented on the earth as the New Jerusalem. But it's not a physical city. It's all of us engaging in our governmental spheres and establishing the kingdom which will fill the earth. Because it talks about the stone cut without hands from a mountain that then filled the whole earth. That's really, I think it's being careful not to try and make something physical out of something which is spiritual, which I think some people try and do. And so for me, this carries spiritual insight principles of government and how government forms and how government works, which we can learn from, because God has got that government pattern in every dimension and in every heavenly sphere, and how they interconnect. And Metatron's cube is an interesting thing, but at the heart of it, when you look at things from above, they look very different from when they look from on the side. So there's different perspectives you can look at things. So when we first started having these engagements with this shape and different shapes, we were all a bit lost, because we were all seeing the same thing from different perspectives. It's like, how do you eat an elephant? One piece at a time. But the tail and the trunk and the legs and they all look different. So you might not think you were eating an elephant by, if you took one piece. And so sometimes you start to see a perspective of something. And we did this in an encounter here. I think 6 or 7 people saw the same thing from different perspectives, and we were all a bit like, what was that? And until we all shared what we saw, and it like that, and discovered this was Metatron's cube, then that led us into understanding the tree of life and the seed of life and how governmental spheres were. It's a long journey of discovering some of this stuff, and we're still at the beginning of that journey, I feel. And I know there's a whole load more to come when it comes to understanding governmental spheres. And our dimension works in a particular way, other dimensions work in other ways. Recently I had an encounter where I went into another dimension, and it didn't, everything was different. It's just like, whoa, this doesn't compute from my understanding how things operate. Even from the realms of heaven, it was totally different from anything I'd ever experienced. But it was God trying to break me free from my preconceived ideas of what things have to be like, and they just don't. Same thing happened, when the first time I was called to go up a waterfall, my soul just couldn't trigger me going up a waterfall because I was tied to gravity in my thinking. So an angel had to take me up the waterfall and, threw me off in a sense. And it was just like, how do I, but as soon as this, whole thing of the Matrix, there is no spoon. You have to see things from a different perspective, which enables you to operate in a whole different laws and governmental system, which is not the earth laws. Every spiritual law, supersedes the natural one, so that cities of refuge will operate under heavenly laws and not earthly ones. So we will not operate in terms of the same thing. So we will have authority to operate completely differently under heaven's government on the earth, which is so hard to define. When I actually do get inspired to share some of it, then I start sharing it from an understanding of quantum physics and through understanding quantum tunneling and quantum entanglement and all the things that now we have some parables that will help us understand how 0-point energy works, how we can fuel and manage things out of that realm into this realm, so we won't need a grid system of power, because we'll be able to draw out of the spiritual realm and empower this realm. There's so much, which is why I had a quantum physics lesson the first encounter in heaven. At that point time didn't really make much sense, But now it makes total sense, you know, because we will be able to control the vibrational frequencies of things and matter and energy, and turn matter into energy and change energy into matter, and we will be able to teleport and trans-relocate and do all those things because we understand the higher laws of that realm. You know, anyway, I'm time to go into any more of it now, but you know, there's a lot there which, you know, is going to be unfurled and revealed, you know, in the next seasons for us to be able to learn how to do these things. Jesus knew how to use that. He knew how to use the understanding of vibration, frequency, resonance to control his physical body in and out of the spiritual realm, and to control the things in the earthly realm so that those things were under his authority. You know, it wasn't just magic that he walked on water. He controlled the vibrational frequency of the molecules of the water and made them solid when his foot touched them. That's how he did it, you know. So yeah, there's a lot of fun to be had when we go into some of these things, and we realize the more we look, the more we don't understand, but the more there is to understand, and it's just like, whoa, you know, there are so many mysteries hidden for us to discover and to unveil and to bring out of darkness and bring into the light. And that's, you know, that's the exciting thing. As sons of the light, we need to manifest the light and the revelation and truth of that, which, you know, is good. Anyway, all right, okay, I better leave it there.